So thanks, everyone. We have some more wonderful speakers lined up. This is going to be a panel on the psychology, perspectives on effective animal advocacy. So our first speaker will be Herzog, who has been investigating aspects of human-animal interactions for over 30 years. These have included studies of the psychology of animal activists, the moral worlds of cockfighters, and public attitudes towards the treatment of animals. He is the author of the book, Some We Love, Some We Hate, Some We Eat, Why It's So Hard to Think Straight About Animals. And in 2013, he was given the Distinguished Scholar Award of the International Society of Anthrozoology. Our second speaker will be Georgia Mason, who's a professor of animal welfare at the University of Guelph. She trained in ethology at Cambridge University, was then a member of Oxford University's Animal Behavior Research Group for 10 years, and then moved to Canada 12 years ago. Her work focuses on the objective assessment of animal well-being and the impacts of impoverished environments. Our third speaker will be Dr. Matthew Ruby, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. His main research program explores the domains of morality, decision-making, and cognitive dissonance in diverse cultural contexts through the lens of a central domain of life, food. In particular, he focuses on how people decide which animal foods are acceptable to eat and which are not, and how people handle the tension that can arise between loving animals and loving meat. Catherine E. Amiot is currently a full professor of psychology at the University of Quebec at Montreal. She completed her undergraduate and graduate degrees in Quebecois and Canadian universities before conducting postdoctoral research at the University of Queensland, Australia. Her research is in the field of social psychology, and more specifically in the areas of intergroup relations and self and identity processes. So, Herzog will get us going.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be asked to be part of the program today, especially because we're here at Princeton, which is the home institution of Peter Singer. And I just finished my PhD in animal behavior back in 1979 when I first read Animal Liberation. And I had gotten interested in our complicated moral relationships with animals because of my work in my doctoral dissertation, which was in part an ethnography of the illegal cockfighting culture in southern Appalachia. And what impressed me about Singer's book was that his argument for animal liberation was not based on sentimentality or his love of all things bright and beautiful. And indeed, in a refreshing statement he wrote in the preface, "I have never been inordinately formed of dogs or cats or horses in the way that other people have." Rather, his case was based on reason and logic. However, I also realized that the cockfighters that I was hanging out with had reason and logical and moral framework that they had, a set of ethical justifications for their participation in this brutal blood sport. In fact, the cockfighters that I knew had thought more about animal issues than most of my graduate student pals who had not given the slightest moral thought to the moral cost of a chicken McNugget. So soon after I read Animal Liberation, the ethologist Gordon Burkhardt and I published a paper in which we argued that in real life, day-to-day moral decisions that people make about the use of animals are not based on theories such as utilitarianism or deontology. Rather, they are snap, gut-level responses rooted less in logic than a convoluted mix of emotion, instinct, language, cultural traditions, and habits. And while Singer wrote that Singer does not count when it comes to animal ethics, we argued that in reality, cuteness means a lot, as do other arbitrary factors such as an animal's size, the degree that it resembles humans, the categories we place them in, such as, for example, pet, pest, and food. When we published that paper 35 years ago, our arguments that the vagaries of human psychology play a critical role in our relationships with other species, I think, still stands. And further, when it comes to changing behavior, that is to effective animal advocacy, an understanding of psychology is as important as advances in moral philosophy. And so what I want to do today is briefly examine some classic views of the psychology of attitude change, and I also want to look at the work of a new breed of psychologists who are exploring how we think about other species, and these include my fellow panelists, Catherine and Matt, today. So since the publication of Animal Liberation 40 years ago, public awareness of animal issues has grown in leaps and bounds. And there have been some remarkable successes. These include a 90% drop in the number of dogs and cats killed in animal shelters, the recent decision of the Ringling Brothers Circus to eliminate its animal act, the elimination of chimpanzees in biomedical research facilities, and successful pressure on agribusiness to make lives better for example, battery hens. On the other hand, there's been relatively little progress in the biggest source of animal suffering, that is our desire to eat them. So as shown in this graph, about 98% of Americans eat meat, a number which has not changed appreciably since the publication of Animal Liberation. And this is particularly interesting when this comes to comparing the lack of success in getting people to stop eating meat to the successful campaigns against cigarette smoking and for example, same-sex marriage and the legalization of marijuana, which has been incredibly rapid change. So with this in mind, what I want to do is give a brief overview of some of the findings in the field of moral psychology that I think are important. And let's take a look, first of all, at the issue of consistency. It's epitomized by this question that you've all considered and have seen. Why do we eat one but not the other? And there are really two contrasting views of moral consistency as it's related to animal protection. The first is exemplified by the environmental philosopher J. Baird Caldecott, who wrote, "Human beings deeply need and mightily strive for consistency and coherence in our outlook on the natural world." And as many of you know, this view reflects one of the most important theories in psychology, Leon Festinger's idea of cognitive dissonance. Festinger argued that people feel mental distress when they try and hold beliefs or values that are blatantly contradictory. Thus, they're motivated to either change their beliefs or behavior or to find evidence, even distorted evidence, which allows them to discount one of the conflicting ideas. The alternative view is exemplified in this exchange. The alternative view is exemplified by this exchange between Brooke Gladstone, host of the National Public Radio Show on the Media, and the well-known blogger Nate Silver. Nate, Brooke asked, is it really possible for people to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time? And Silver responded simply, absolutely, Brooke, people are complicated. The idea that humans are in fact capable of simultaneously holding conflicting ideas about the treatment of animals was nicely summarized by Andrew Rowan, president of the Humane Society International, who many of you know, who once commented after a talk that I gave, he said, "Hal, the only consistency about how humans think about animals is inconsistency," which I now call Rowan's paradox. So here are a few examples of flagrant moral consistency dealing with animals. In 2015, a Gallup poll found that 2/3 of Americans agreed with the statement, animals should have the exact same rights as people to be free of harm and exploitation. But an examination of how much money we spend on animal protection each year tells quite a different story. Americans spend between $3 and $5 billion a year on animal protection. That's only a little over 1% of our total charitable giving. And it's very small potatoes compared to the roughly $60 billion we spend on animal research, nearly $100 billion on hunting and fishing, and over $200 billion on the animals that we eat. In short, we fork out roughly 100 times as much money killing animals than we do on saving them. And then there's the obvious paradox that the vast majority of the people that said that in the Gallup poll that they thought animals should have the same rights as humans regularly eat the animals that they thought were just like us. Indeed, when it comes to meat, even most vegetarians are inconsistent. The United States Department of Agriculture conducted a telephone survey of the diets of 13,000 randomly selected Americans. 3% of the sample said they were vegetarians. However, these same people were called back 2 weeks later and asked what they had eaten the day before. 67% of the vegetarians had eaten some form of animal flesh in the previous 24 hours. The pull of meat on the human psyche is also evidenced by a large 2014 survey by the Human Animal Research Council, now called Fauna-Lytics. They found that 85% of the vegetarians and 70% of the vegans in their sample had gone back to eating meat. Morgan Childers and I investigated the primary reasons that even long-term vegetarians returned to eating animals, and some of the reasons were shown here. The most common reason was concerns about their health. This was followed by the hassle factor. They grew tired of cooking vegetarian meals and seeking out vegetarian restaurants. This was followed by cravings for meat and then social motivation. So very, very few of the people that we interviewed had changed their mind about the moral status of animals. That is, they didn't change their mind about the morality of animals, but yet they were now consuming meat. So this evidence shows the obvious, which is that most people can love animals and love to eat them without showing any signs of guilt or moral angst. Well, do these sorts of blatant inconsistencies mean that cognitive dissonance simply does not apply when it comes to animal ethics? No, and in a few minutes, Matt Ruby is going to discuss his really interesting research and important research on rationalizations people use to justify carnivory. But indeed, recent studies have shown that dissonance can motivate some shifts in attitudes towards animals. For example, Steve Lonin and his colleagues have found that the very act of eating meat changes people's views about the moral status of animals. In this experiment, for example, subjects who ate a small piece of beef, dried beef, rated their level of concern for the moral status of cows lower than did subjects who ate nuts. And Eric Anderson at Tufts University, Tufts University recently found that false information about how an animal was raised can change how its flesh changes. In his study, meat from pigs the subjects thought were humanely raised was rated as less salty, less greasy, and fresher tasting than meat from pigs they thought had been raised on intensive factory farms. So it appears that cognitive dissonance can play a role in how we think about the moral status of animals and even how they taste. However, I continue to be more impressed by the ability of most people to live easily with moral contradictions. Indeed, the downside to slavish adherence to ethical consistency is that it can lead to moral judgments that defy common sense. Take the book Speciesism by Joan du Pont. Her case for animal liberation is based on her ad absurdum extension of Peter Singer's utilitarian argument. But while her ideas would make our lives more morally consistent, very morally consistent, her ideas are impossible to take seriously. It would be impossible to live in her world. For example, Dunninger concludes that a spider has as much right to life as a person, that termites have the right to eat your house, and you should flip a coin when deciding whether to save a puppy or a human being from human infant from a burning building. Dunninger's extremism illustrates what happens when, as my philosopher friend David Henderson says, ethicists get caught in the grip of a theory. In short, consistency can be overrated as a moral principle. And Dunninger illustrates why effective animal advocacy needs to make allowances for common sense and moral intuition. And for this, we turn to a different view of moral psychology. In the 1970s and 80s, moral psychology was dominated by the work of psychologists such as Lawrence Kohlberg, who saw moral thinking as a completely rational process, one that becomes more sophisticated as we go from childhood to adulthood. In the 1990s, however, an alternative theory of human morality emerged, which downplays the rational part of our brains and puts emphasis on rapid gut-level decision-making. In this view, when it comes to moral thinking, humans are more like Homer Simpson than we are like Immanuel Kant or Jeremy Bentham. An example of this approach to moral psychology is Jonathan Haidt's social intuitionist model. According to Haidt, moral judgments are a product of the interaction of two rival mental operating systems. System one is emotion-based. It's instantaneous. It's unconscious. He compares it to a large and powerful elephant. And while the elephant is usually in control, it can be influenced by the smaller but smarter rider. System two, the rider is slower, conscious, and rational. Haidt argues that frequently, but not always, it's the elephant that calls the shots. And the rider's primary job is to come up with post hoc justifications for moral judgments we have already made at the gut level by System 1. This model of morality was nicely summed up by an animal activist that I once interviewed named Karen. When I asked her about the relative importance of logic and emotion in her conversion to activism, she said, "For me, it always stems from the emotional, but I have to find an intellectual rationalization for my emotional reactions. Otherwise, people won't take me seriously." And I want to conclude by returning to animal liberation. Most books on ethics are written by philosophers for philosophers. And as a result, they're incomprehensible to the lay reader and have little impact outside the rarefied world of academic discourse. Animal liberation was different. In the preference to the first edition, Singer wrote that he and his wife were not animal lovers per se, and that the book makes no appeals for sympathy for cute animals. However, it was not the case that Singer didn't appeal to the emotions. For example, over half the book is devoted to graphic descriptions of animal cruelty in laboratories on factory farms, combined with photographs of animal abuse. In short, the amazing impact of animal liberation on our culture stems from the fact that Singer had hit the moral sweet spot. His book successfully combined a powerful and coherent logical argument with appeal to the heartstrings. Thus, animal liberation exemplifies my argument that when it comes to changing attitudes towards animals, logic is simply not enough. Effective animal advocacy must appeal to both the emotional elephant and its rational rider, and that's why animal advocates need to pay attention to the fields of moral and social psychology. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So now I'm going to change topic a little bit, and I'm going to focus on animals. And I'm going to ask the question, or psychology of animals, rather, sorry. When a carnivore paces in its cage, as shown here, or a lab mouse plucks out his own fur, or a sow bites the bars of her crate, what does this tell us about animal well-being? And this might seem very obvious, but there are very different views out there. So some might argue, like some advocacy groups do, that this indicates that animals have been driven insane by stress. But others claim that the behaviors are as innocuous as a dog wagging its tail, or that they're just like the repeated habits that we all have in our everyday lives, or that the animal is just relaxing or chilling out in some way. Empirically, it seems that the truth may span the full range of extremes represented by these claims. And that's because stereotypies and other abnormal repetitive behaviors, I cannot get the video to show, I'll have to imitate it. So stereotypies and abnormal repetitive behaviors, a broader term, are defined purely descriptively in terms of being repetitive and rather strange looking. They're not defined in terms of their external causes or their underlying mechanisms. And as a consequence, abnormal repetitive behaviors, or ARBs as I'll call them, they're not a natural group, they're heterogeneous. And they range from those that we know or suspect are benign, through to those that we suspect are caused by pathology and actually cause the animal harm. So here we have the result of severe self-scratching in a laboratory mouse. Just as an aside, I should say that I found this cute GIF of Maggie from The Simpsons by Googling Maggie sucking GIF, and I would just recommend never doing this. You're using up my 13 minutes, but thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk then about what are the main risk factors for ARB? How do they relate to other signs of animal well-being? What do we know about their underlying mechanisms? And then I'm going to ask, are they all zookoses, signs of madness, and are any of them benign? So I'm going to focus first on the external risk factors and how these relate to other signs of animal welfare. So the research shows that there are 4 key risk factors for abnormal repetitive behaviors. There are unnatural rearing conditions early in life. Current housing conditions are important for ARBs in animals. Then what happens in between is also important, so a lifetime of repeated stress seems very crucial. And then within that, there are individual predispositions or aspects of animal personality. So first of all, if we start at the beginning of life, so unnatural rearing conditions have a lasting effect on adult phenotype. So animals that are raised with, for example, maternal deprivation will be prone to ARB throughout the rest of their lives. And this has been best studied in laboratory animals, so early weaned rodents or primates who are reared in nurseries rather than with adult females will grow up to become adults that are more prone to ARB. And the same is true with physically unnatural rearing conditions. So animals that are raised in small barren enclosures, even if they're then moved to large enriched ones, will show a lasting effect of their early experience. So they'll be more prone to ARB, even if their environments then improve. But how an animal is kept now is also extremely important. And so in terms of current environment, we know that being exposed to inescapable frightening stimuli, food restriction, as in this sow here, and being housed in barren, impoverished environments, these are all crucial causal factors in the here and now. So to give you an example of the role of barren environments, this graph sums up research from 17 studies of zoo animals divided into carnivores and primates. The control environments are non-enriched, and then the animals are given enrichments, and you can see that this approximately halves the amount of stereotypy that they're doing. So I've talked about early experience, I've talked about current current conditions, but also everything in between seems important as well. So it seems that ARBs may actually track lifetime welfare. And the two nicest examples, or most convincing examples of this, come from studies of primates and also studies of zoo elephants. So in research primates, animals who've in their past experienced a large number of research procedures and have also been repeatedly isolated from conspecifics, here and now will be very prone to ARB. And recently, it's been shown that something similar is happening in zoo elephants. So if you look at, this was a recent survey of all the elephants held in zoos in AZA zoos, and animals' current levels of stereotypic rocking and the like were shown to be predicted by how often they'd been moved between zoos in their past. And some animals here are being moved 4, 5, 6, up to 9 times in their past, which is a repeated breaking of social bonds, and this seems to result in an animal which is more and more stereotypic. So we can see that unnatural rearing conditions, current housing, and a lifetime of stress all seem to be risk factors, and these would all strongly seem to be treatments that reduce animal well-being. But what is the empirical evidence for this, aside from sort of intuition? So about 12 years ago, a PhD student and myself just we basically went through all the crap in my office, if the truth be told. We went through all the papers on ARB, and we divided them up into, to ask the question, do treatments that induce or exacerbate ARB typically cause other signs of stress as well? So, for example, weaning ages that promote ARB, or how cage sizes or degrees of enrichment. If we look at treatments that exacerbate these behaviours, do we see other signs, for example, escape attempts, alarm calling, problems with fertility, other signs of physiological stress? And we found about 190 studies, and of these, round about 130 showed that treatments that induce or exacerbate ARB do indeed cause other signs of stress in these groups of animals. But there are some notable exceptions, which I can talk about if there's time, but typically these behaviours are indeed indicating suboptimal conditions. But within these conditions, we see lots of individual variation, and this individual variation often has a genetic basis. So we can have high or low ARB animals within a given housing condition, and you can select against this behaviour if you want to. But the problem here is that within these housing conditions, the individuals who are most prone to this behaviour don't necessarily have the poorest welfare. Indeed, sometimes the opposite is the case. So for examples, if you look at identically housed rhesus monkeys, those with the most ARB tend to have the most bold, exploratory, active personalities, and the ones with the least ARB are quiet and timid. In deer mice, animals that show the most stereotypic backflipping show the best reproduction. And in C57 laboratory mice, animals with high ARB are protected from signs of depression, so they show the least learned helplessness in tests for this. So this surprising pattern was actually shown in our meta-analysis as well. So when we looked at studies that looked at individual differences within animals that are housed identically, we found about 80 studies that showed this, and in most of them, 55, high levels of ARB were associated with surprisingly relatively good well-being compared with animals that weren't showing this behaviour in the identical housing conditions. And I'll just show you here the graph that compares treatment groups to show how different they are. So comparing treatment groups shows ARB as bad, But looking within treatment groups shows that maybe it's quite a good strategy for dealing with these conditions. And one possibility is that animals are helping themselves to cope with these suboptimal conditions. And what this chicken is doing is something I'll tell you in a few slides' time. Okay, so then what are the underlying mechanisms? Biologically, where do these behaviors come from? So some ARBs very clearly represent analogues of normal behavior. They just derive from normal specific motor patterns that are shown in an odd way because the environment's odd, but they may have just the same functional consequences as the normal behavior. So here's an example of feather plucking, which is common in laying hens. Here we see a victim of feather plucking, and here we see a rare picture of one of the perpetrators running off with a feather in her beak. And feather peckers very often ingest the feathers, and it seems as though the feathers are actually taking the place of missing dietary fiber, and they help promote normal gastrointestinal function. In other words, birds without normal foraging opportunities are plucking feathers in order to keep themselves regular. So this ARB would seem to be an adaptive response to a captive environment. In other cases, we see that ARBs are derived from other normal behaviors. So this is scrabbling in a laboratory gerbil, and this scrabbling derives from the lack of a normal burrow system. So if you were to give them a naturalistic burrow system like they'd have in their normal desert homes, this behavior stops. So it seems to represent the attempt to get a burrow system like a normal one. But obviously the animal isn't getting anywhere at all, so we might label this maladaptive. You've got an animal doing a normal behavior, but that behavior isn't working. But the extreme persistence of some of these behaviors has led people to wonder, well, why isn't the gerbil giving up? You know, maybe there's something actually wrong with it. And so about 15, 20 years ago, people began to wonder whether ARBs in captive animals might sometimes indicate pathology or malfunction. And this idea was inspired partly by some of the oddness of some of these behaviors, but also by the fact that in some clinical disorders, ARBs are common. So they're diagnostic of autism, they're very common in people with schizophrenia, they're a feature of OCD as well. And in humans who perform ARBs because they have these clinical conditions, here the ARBs are really the tip of an iceberg of altered behavioral organization. So these people don't just show individual repetitive movements, but they also typically have many other signs of just being very behaviorally inflexible. So people with high ARBs will often have very restricted interests. They'll be very prone to routines. And in tasks in the lab where they're asked to do tasks or play games that require behavioral flexibility, they will show inappropriately repeated responses. So, for example, if they're taught to do a simple task and then that task stops working, they may learn the task fine, but then find it very hard to give up that task. And this sort of inappropriate response repetition is known as perseveration. And as a consequence of this behavioral inflexibility, people with ARBs are typically quite socially odd. They're not brilliant at the give and take of normal social interactions. And in many cases, we know the neurological underpinnings of this. We know they have altered basal ganglia function. And the basal ganglia are regions deep within the midbrain, deep within the forebrain. Working. Represented here. So this is a slice through the brain, sort of taken here, sort of through your ears. And the basal ganglia are involved with organizing behavior. They become impaired in people with Huntington's and with Parkinson's, for example. And we also know they're altered in people with ARB because, for example, they have autism. So could we see similar changes in behavioral organization and even brain function in animals with ARB? So there's quite a lot of hints of evidence consistent with this, but I think there's only two strong cases where we have really good evidence. And the first comes from some studies of deer mice done by neuroscientists working at the University of Florida. And they found that caging alters basal ganglia function in a way that induces ARBs. So inhibitory regions of these I can't speak today, sorry. Inhibitory regions of the basal ganglia become underactive, leading to the overactivation of behavior. And this is a product of non-enriched cages. It's not a problem in animals in large enriched enclosures. And this reduced inhibition predicts high levels of abnormal somersaulting and jumping. So that's one piece of neuroscientific evidence. And then the other evidence comes from work from my lab looking at mink, and we took a behavioral approach to ask whether animals with high levels of ARB are impaired in their social interactions. So we compared mink that are raised in standard barren cages with mink who are raised in large enriched enclosures. The barren raised mink showed more pacing and head twirling, their common ARBs. They also tended to be more prone to routines. So in an extinction task, where we taught them a simple Y maze, left, right, go to the right arm, you get a treat sort of thing. The non-enriched animals tended to be bad at extinction learning. The non-enriched animals were also less successful with females. So we did a mate choice task where we had a number of females who were each given a choice between two potential suitors, one who'd been raised in an enriched cage, one who'd been raised in a barren cage. Mink are sexually dimorphic, so my student Maria Diaz cut these little holes that only the female could get through, and the male could do nothing except stand there going, me, I'm the one that you want. And we found that in this experiment, the barren-raised males gained fewer matings with the females. And beautifully, we found this effect was predicted by how stereotypic they were, how much pacing and head twirling they did. It was also predicted by how poor they were at extinction learning. So we think in this species, impoverished raised animals become stuck in behavioral ruts, and this impairs their social interactions. Interestingly, another ARB that this animal shows, scrabbling, did not predict any of these deficits. Okay, so are any ARBs zoocoses, and are any of them benign? So we've shown that captive animals with ARBs can sometimes have autism-like malfunctions within their forebrain. But we also know that is not true of all forms. It's definitely not true of some forms. And for the vast majority, we simply don't know. So I think arguing that all captive animals have been driven insane goes beyond the data, though it may be true in some cases. And they're so heterogeneous, these behaviors, that we can't study one and extrapolate to all other forms. So are any forms instead completely benign, as some people, particularly senior people in the zoo world, would sometimes like us to believe? These claims are much, much weaker, especially as we can see empirically that most ARBs reflect past or present poor well-being. So it's not impossible that some ARBs are benign, but it is very unlikely. So this isn't a claim that should be made without more evidence. So I now have no time. So I'm just going to wrap up with my final slide that sums up everything. There we go. So, do I have time to read through that? Okay, so the main risk factors for ARB are typically past or present suboptimal treatment, but within these treatment groups, high ARB individuals may be the relatively better off. Their underlying mechanisms are often highly motivated normal activities and possibly sometimes malfunctional changes in how the brain patterns behavior. They're not all zoocoses, but some are. And maybe some of them are benign, but the chances are very low. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, great. It's really great to be here today. I'm very excited to be presenting this research on the notion of solidarity with animals. And basically with this work, we've got two main questions we're interested in. So first of all, we wonder, can we humans identify with animals as one and broad, very inclusive social group? And as well, what are the consequences of this sense of identification? Consequences both for animals, but also consequences for humans. So I think everyone here will agree that human-animal relations are ubiquitous and very important to human life. And to capture this phenomena, I'm really taking the point of view of the theories of intergroup relations. So my work is quite theoretical at the moment, and of course we can discuss all the implications as well later. But what I'll try to argue and show is that those theories are useful to really capture the part of our human identity that we share with the non-human animals, because we are animals. And for that, I'm focusing on the notion of solidarity with animals and its implication, of course, for animals, but for humans as well. So what happens, for instance, when we need to make decisions about scarce resource distribution, for instance, between animals and humans? So I'm a social psychologist, and when I started basically reading and getting acquainted with the human-animal relations literature in psychology, I discovered there was a lot of research already conducted in this field. And Rod Bastian and I decided to put together a review paper about everything that had been done up to that point, and really to make the point that in psychology it's important that people pay more attention to that domain of human life. And as well, that psychological principles do apply to understand our relationship with non-human animals. So basically, we've organized a review into those 6 sections that look at very classic themes in psychology. And what I'd like to focus on today is really the last aspect, the intergroup principles. So Scott Klaus was among the first social psychs to really say, well, relationship between humans and animals can be understood from the theories of the point of view of theories of intergroup relations. So all the us versus them dynamics, the conflict, the exploitations, theories of intergroup relations are about that. And I'm just going to make a very long story quite short, just by telling you a couple of things about social identity theory that was actually that's quite used as of now in intergroup relations research. But it's Henry Tashfeld, one of the founders of this theory. Henry Tashfeld was actually a Polish Jew, and during World War II, he was in the concentration camp. And Henry Tashfeld was a chemist, but because of this very shocking experience, to say the least, when he was in the concentration camp, he began to wonder and think, why do humans engage in such horrible actions? Why do people engage in genocides? And at a less, delicate level, why do people have prejudice and discriminate as well? So when he got out of those camps, he was very motivated to go in psychology, explain this phenomena, and then with his team, he was really pushing these ideas that psychology should also look at group dynamics to really understand the impact on people's lives. So Henry Tashfeld didn't say anything that I know about animals, but I'm sure he would agree that this theory can be applied in that realm as well. And in the theories of intergroup relations, social identity is a very central construct. It's this part of the self-concept that derives from the fact that we belong to our social groups. And solidarity with animals is one dimension, one facet of this sense of identification. And we've been defining solidarity with animals as one psychological bond with and a feeling of commitment towards animals. So it's a very relational dimension of identification. So social identities are in our minds. They're derived from the groups, the social group we belong to. They shape, they guide our behavior, the groups that we belong to, and we definitely behave differently to in-group and out-group members. So we could expect on that basis that if people feel a lot of solidarity towards animals, they're probably going to have more positive attitudes and behaviors towards them. But what about now with humans, when people need to make scarce resource distributions between animals and humans? Will solidarity also come into play? So I'm presenting today 5 relatively simple studies that look at the notion of solidarity with animals, validate the construct, as well as look at the antecedents and consequences of this variable. So we've got convenient sample for this work, so either university students or people in the general population recruited online. We adapted a social identification scale to assess solidarity with animals, or these are the items we're using. So to what extent do people feel a strong bond towards other animals? They feel solidarity, commitment towards them. And in study 1, we also included some other social identification measures, solidarity with humans and identification with nature. Those are 2 very broad social identity. In this study, we also had 2 animal-related outcomes, so speciesism and moral concerns towards 20 animals. So on the whole, what we find is that people generally endorse the solidarity with animal items quite moderately. And it's normal distribution, so that's really encouraging. And we've got like a good coherence in that scale. So it seems like it's a meaningful construct to people, and people can indeed feel solidarity with animals as well. Now, when we're predicting the outcomes of speciesism and moral concerns towards animals, we're finding that solidarity with animals is the clearest predictor. It predicts lower speciesism, more moral concerns towards animals compared to the two other subordinate identities, so solidarity with nature's, solidarity with humans and identification with nature. So those were encouraging findings, but with study 2, we wanted to further test how solidarity with animals could correlate with other relevant notions in psychology. So we assessed, that was a study conducted online, we assessed solidarity with animals. We expected this variable to correlate with more empathy, as well as greater openness to experience, because those are personality predispositions that are quite flexible, quite inclusive as well. And we expected solidarity with animals to be associated with more anthropomorphism, especially anthropomorphism of animals, as well as to more secure pet attachment. And on the whole, that's what we find. So the more people report solidarity with animals, the greater their empathy, the greater their tendency to anthropomorphize, especially animals, the greater their openness to experience, the less avoidantly attached they are likely to be to their pet, as expected, but the more anxiously attached they are to their pet, suggesting that this solidarity notion might make people more aware of the fragility, the impermanence of our relationship with pets, of course, by nature. Okay, so that was also good evidence for the construct, but with study 3, we wondered, where could we find a group of people who are particularly likely to be high in terms of solidarity with animals? So we turned to vegetarians. And of course, as we know, vegetarians can have a range of motives for endorsing this lifestyle. Well, one of them is because of their concerns for animals. So we expected them to report higher solidarity with animals. And we also assessed frequency of meat eating, just to have a bit of a wider measure, because some people might restrict meat intake indeed. So we wanted to see whether there was a correlation there. So in green, vegetarians do report higher solidarity with animals compared to the non-vegetarians. And we also found a correlation showing the more people feel solidarity with animals, the lower number of portions of meat they'll tend to eat on average every week. So this brings support for the construct. Now, with study 4, we wondered, can we increase solidarity with animals? Can we create a situation where people are going to increase their feelings of commitment and connection to non-human animals? So we designed an experiment. And in the human-animal literature, similarity perceived similarity or objective similarity between humans and animals does predict more positive attitudes towards them. It even predicts a greater desire to want to protect the animals. So we assigned people to 3 conditions, expecting really that it would be when activating the similarities between animals and humans, that we'd get higher solidarity. People who saw the similar animals saw those pictures, those 7 pictures of animals. So as you can see, in this condition, we present pictures of animals and focus on their face. So really to focus on the cognitive capacity in humans, all those cognitive features we really highlight also to distinguish ourselves from non-human animals. So we decided to focus on that, to bring animals closer to humans. And also, as you can see, those animals have emotions, but it's complex emotions. It's emotions that we typically think only humans can feel. Well, maybe not us, but people in general. So contempt, pride, those are emotions displayed in the animal. In the different animals condition, we've got exactly the same species of animals, but now they're presented in prototypical poses in their natural habitats. And in the control condition, just pictures of urban architecture. No insects, nothing that relates to animals. So what we find is indeed people who saw the similar to human animals reported higher solidarity with them compared to both the control and the difference condition when put together. So this basically shows that we can shift this feeling of commitment and solidarity. So that's quite encouraging. Finally, fifth study, I think 5 minutes. Okay, so I went faster than I thought. Okay. So basically with this last study, we wanted to further look at the consequences associated with identification with solidarity with animals. And we wanted also to look at those as correlations and associations by using a longitudinal design. So basically in this study, we assessed solidarity with animals at time 1. And then 5 months later, we sent out a questionnaire, the online questionnaire to our participants, and then we assessed the outcomes likely to be associated with solidarity. So we assessed again speciesism, moral concerns towards animals, as in study 1. We also included a variable looking at how much people use justification for justifying their use of animals, like meat eating, for instance. And then if we've got some associations there, that's even stronger because there's a 5-month gap in between the two measurements. At time 2, we also assess collective action intention and resource distribution. So we told people basically, let's say you have a budget of $100. How would you distribute this money to different charities? Charities that seek to help humans, charities that seek to help animals. And we created a different score. So basically, this score represents a bias in favor of wanting to advance charities that help humans relative to helping animals. So it's a human bias measure. We also presented people with 3 moral dilemmas. We told them in life and death decisions, whose life would you want to save? The life of 1 human versus the life of 10 dogs. We also asked them about their collective action intention in 6 months' time, as well as their level of animal rights activism. So what we find, we replicate study 1 findings, showing solidarity with animals at time 1 predicts 5 months later lower speciesism, more moral concerns towards animals, and a lower tendency to want to use justification for using animals for human purposes. But we also found links with the donation data, basically showing that solidarity with animals predicts a lower tendency to want to advantage humans over animals in those donations. As well, solidarity with animals predicts a greater tendency, well, basically the reverse. It predicts a lower tendency to want to save the life of 1 human versus the dogs. It predicts also greater intentions to engage in collective actions on behalf of animals and a greater tendency to be an animal rights activist. So this replicates study 1 findings, goes a bit beyond it with the longitudinal design and the other measures as well. So now in terms of future work, where to go from here, I think it's going to be very interesting to look at how solidarity with animals develops over time. Yes, we've changed it experimentally, but how does it shape up over time with the contacts with pets, with other kinds of animals, with nature perhaps as well? It's going to be also very interesting and important for future work to account for the role of culture, because definitely this research is mainly done with Occidental countries, but what about in other cultures as well? And now, at the moment, we're also investigating different dimensions of identification with animals, not just solidarity, but other dimensions, such as satisfaction. To what extent are people positive and satisfied and proud to be an animal? So we're seeing different effects there. So, thank you very much.